Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Joseph Smith Podcast, brought to you by Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. John DeLynn. It is May 27th, 2025, and today we are continuing with part two in this brand new series, where we're starting this podcast series with the book Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet by Dr. John G. Turner. For those who didn't join us already, this is part two in a series. Last episode, we met with Dr. Turner to talk about, or John, to talk about his reasons for writing this biography, his motives, and then we talked about sort of Joseph Smith's family, his ancestors, and his upbringing prior to, I guess we could say 1820-ish timeframe. So today we are going to be covering First Vision kind of stuff, Joseph Smith's first vision and his treasure digging. And if we have time, we're going to talk about his, Moroni story and his claim to be promised plates and his attempts to get the plates, everything sort of preceding the translation of the Book of Mormon. And again, the value I see in having John Turner on is number one, he's a great historian. Number two, this is a great book that we're covering. And number three, he's never been Mormon. And so unlike Fawn Brody or Richard Bushman, we're getting an outsider's view with a credible top-notch historian like Michael Coe or Robert Rittner in their respective fields. We're getting a top-notch historian getting their views, calling balls and strikes on Joseph Smith. We've told all of you that the way that we can afford to do this, we want to pay John for his time. We also have production costs. So the way that we're doing this is we're asking those of you who value this content to support it financially. So we're happy to announce that 9 of you so far after episode 1 donated to this project. We're grateful for those of you who donated. If you want to see this project continue or if you value it, all you have to do is go to donorbox.org/Joseph Smith and become a monthly donor. And as long as we have the money to pay John what he deserves, or at least something, and to cover our production costs, we'll do at least 10 episodes of this amazing book, if not more. And then we'll see if Joseph Smith, the podcast, is worth continuing after that as well. All right. So without any further ado, Professor John Turner, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks, John. Excited to be back with you.
Really quickly, it's been a week since we released episode 1. Anything you want to share about feedback, responses, how you're feeling about this so far?
Super fun. I mean, one of the things I think I probably said it last time. One of the things that I love about Mormon history is so many people care about it. You can write about all sorts of historical subjects, which can maybe really excite you as an author, but it's sort of a privilege to write about something that people care deeply about and want to engage on. So I think I got a few emails from folks who listened to the first episode, which I love. I love hearing from people, love getting, thoughts back at me, whether or not they accord with my own. So this is a lot of fun.
Any hot takes or controversies that come to mind in terms of what people have shared so far?
Well, one thing. I mean, I don't really like to share too much about things I receive privately, but it's always of interest to me, actually, and this is a sort of a segue into today's topic. It's interesting to me how hotly debated so many aspects of the first vision remain. So the timing of it, the content, the different accounts. There are other aspects or other points of Joseph Smith's life that are, of course, also controversial and stir a lot of discussion. It actually surprises me. I mean, I think I understand why, but it surprises me how hotly debated the first vision remains.
Okay. And was that feedback from, is that just kind of a segue to today, or did people already start talking to you reaching out to you to discuss the first vision?
I had one person over the last week really reach out about that in particular, which helped me get me even more excited to talk about it today.
That's fun. Okay, cool. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to dive in. So let's just go ahead and do that. Today we're going to be covering, if we have all the time, chapters 2 and 3 of this book. Chapter 2 is called Light, and it covers 1817 to 1825. But let's go ahead and just start. I know you're prepared to talk about certain things, and you're excited to talk about certain things. So why don't I give the floor over to you, and then I'll start peppering you with questions.
Yeah. So I think one thing that to me seems persuasive is that at some point in his early teens, Joseph Smith has a powerful spiritual experience. I think the only, the first reference that we have to it actually comes from the 1830 Articles and Covenants, in which there's a reference to Joseph having received, I think, manumission of his sins or forgiveness of his sins, which accords with the 1832 handwritten account that Joseph makes of his earliest vision. And so I think that's kind of a good starting point to put us back in the religious world of the Smith family in the late 18 teens, early 1820s. They're living in a Protestant culture that features a large number of camp meetings and revivals at which people have emotional experiences of repentance and forgiveness and an assurance of divine pardon. And I think it's to me, from Joseph's histories and his comments, he very much wanted to participate in that culture. He did have a deep sense of his own sinfulness, shortcomings, transgressions, and we know that he went to some of these revival meetings, that he sometimes even took a push cart of his family's baked goods and I think root beer or something like that to sell at them, which is a really quaint idea, I think. And so he saw other people having powerful spiritual experiences, and I think he deeply wanted that for himself as well. And I think over the last, 250 years of religion in the United States, there have been a lot of young people who have, gone through, that similar yearning for that sort of, I would say, Protestant revival experience.
Let me as kind of a little bit of context to discussing Joseph Smith's experience particularly, I love that you set up in the book, this idea that I think we read in every Joseph Smith biography, this idea of a burned over district, which, as I understand it, means there were just a lot of religious revivals in the Palmyra area, in upstate New York. Let's just say 1818 to 1822, 24. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So, I think because Joseph, in, I think, the canonical account of the first vision, which really takes shape in the late 1830s, because he refers specifically to revivalism, I think, right in 1820, historians have spent a lot of time searching newspapers and memoirs and any other sources that might shed light on revival activity in and around Palmyra, sometimes with a desire to corroborate Joseph's account of his first vision, sometimes with a desire to discredit it if you can't find, enough corroborating revival activity. My own opinion is there's simply a lot of revivals. There are a lot of camp meetings held near Palmyra and in the broader vicinity during this whole time period. So I personally think some of those arguments are, rather unnecessary. What Joseph says about the context, I think that's reasonably credible. He attended revivals. I don't think it necessarily matters whether there was a big one in, the spring of 1820 right in Palmyra or not. I think that was a significant part of his religious culture. He was exposed to it. He understood it. He, on some level, wanted to participate in it. Maybe on some level, held back because of the reservations of his father or other family members, but he was at least right on the border and the threshold of that revival experience.
Okay, and just because you bring that up, as I'm remembering years ago when I first learned, and this was again in my 30s, that there were multiple versions of his recounting of the first vision, and that they all come, I don't know, 12 to 20 years after the fact, as far as I understand. Then when I was digging into reading each one, if I'm remembering right, sometimes he's 14, sometimes he's younger, sometimes he's 15, sometimes he's 16. And that year seems, to be trying to be pegged to whenever it was that he attended or was experiencing some sorts of revivals. And so it's not just, so if we speak to the fact that there have been multiple accounts, and, you're saying what I think is reasonable, which is, look, revivals happened. It doesn't quite matter when. He was in a context of revivals. And so in no way should we look at whether the exact date of a revival corresponds as invalidating to his claim that he did have. What about the ages? Some would say, well, if it's 14 in one version and 15 or 16 in another, then all of a sudden, if you're actually seeing God or seeing God in Jesus or just Jesus, you should be able to get a date and an age right. And again, that's usually pegged to a date of a reasonable time for a revival. And please, I know I'm making mincemeat of the evidence, so feel free to clear it all up.
Well, I mean, we can't totally clear it all up, which is one reason I think people keep arguing about it. So I think it sort of depends on what question you're trying to answer. If you're looking for historically verifiable evidence of whether or not God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith in 1820, then maybe all of the particulars matter, in the sense of, if you absolutely want to try to corroborate the exact content of the church's canonical account, then these minutiae matter. If you simply want to try to understand Joseph Smith's religious experiences as a young man, then I think the details actually matter a little bit less. So if the question is it reasonable to think that Joseph Smith experienced forgiveness of sins or a vision of Jesus Christ or of two divine beings when he was 14, 15, 16? I think given his family's background, given the culture in which he lives, it's not surprising, or it's at least not totally out of left field that he reports an experience along these lines. Going from that to try to corroborate what became a scripture for Latter-day Saints, that's a totally different matter. So I understand why people care about the details. I think we can't really access those details with historical evidence that would corroborate them as much as we would like. And I think so to not find a big revival right in Palmyra, say in March, April, May of 1820, to me, that in and of itself, that doesn't discredit Joseph. likewise, to find that there were a lot of revivals in the area during that time period, that doesn't really provide evidence that divine beings appeared to Joseph Smith.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the I guess one last thing would be, and again, none of us will ever be able to know what he did or didn't experience. It's more a matter of, does the existing evidence sort of like really send off the alarm of this sounds like a fraud? And so maybe a way to close this particular part of the discussion is, does the age changing from 14 to 15 to 16 and the question of revivals, does that set off alarms for you that like something shady's going on if the accounts come 10 to 12 to 20 years later? And if the age is changing, does that set off alarms for you particularly? That maybe he just made it all up in the 1830s once he was, trying to claim a more solid foundation for his starting of the church? Or does it not? You know what I mean?
It doesn't really set off alarm bells. Now, if we get into the particulars of the different accounts, again, I wouldn't call them alarm bells, but I think maybe it makes sense, John, to take these in order. So when Joseph first sets pen to paper and writes a several-page history of his early life in 1832, he describes mourning because of his sinfulness, crying out to the Lord, seeing a pillar of fire or light, and then seeing Jesus Christ, who assures him that his sins are forgiven. At the same time, there's in that vision, or in that 1832 account, Joseph already states his belief that the existing churches are in apostasy, and Jesus confirms that in what he tells Joseph, along with the forgiveness of sins. Now, given everything that we know about the background of the Smith family and this culture of revivalism, I think both of those things seem not totally unexpected, that Joseph would seek forgiveness for his sins and that he believed that none of the existing churches were true or valid. So that doesn't seem uncredible to me. I think when the story gets further developed in the late 1830s, there are some shifts, and I don't think it's unreasonable to think that they reflect not only that early spiritual experience, but also, additional developments in Joseph's thought and self-understanding and his understanding of the church as it progressed.
But before we maybe, and I don't know if you want to address those, but before we do, really quickly, some people would want to find any evidence between 1820 and 1832 that he told this story. If you see God Almighty, if you're close to your parents, if your parents are visionary people, and your book talks about the visions that Lucy, Joseph's mom, and Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph's dad, they were having visions. I'm sure you're going to say that there were lots of people in, New England between 1810 and 1825 claiming to have visits with God or the Lord. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily even remarkable that someone would claim to have a visit from Jesus or from God and Jesus or whatever. But some would expect that he would tell Alvin, that he would tell Hiram, that he would tell Lucy or Joseph Smith Sr., that it would be written down in a journal somewhere, that he would have told Emma, that it wouldn't be showing up until, like you say, 1830. And also you mentioned an account where he goes to a pastor and tells the pastor, and then the pastor sort of negates it. Is there any evidence that ever happened? And if not, how do we explain as a potential problem the fact that the story emerges so late?
It's a good question. I mean, I think ultimately we don't know. I think one thing I would say is, last time we talked about the fact that Lucy Mack Smith and Joseph Smith Sr. had dreams and visions. Lucy creates a record of those in 1844 when she dictates her history. If we didn't have that history, we would have no record of her visions or the dreams and visions of her husband. So I think it actually is not crazy to think that people could have powerful religious experiences, maybe share them within the family. I kind of presume Joseph did to some extent, but maybe not share them very broadly. The other thing about Joseph's first vision is, no matter which account you look at, it's a pretty transitory sort of experience, and that's not also super unusual for people who had sort of revival era conversion experiences, or even down to the present day in Protestant contexts. Some people have super powerful spiritual experiences, have a very intense emotional or even visionary moment. And then Joseph says his life sort of reverted to the norm and became mundane. He fell into transgressions again. And certainly by that point, I wouldn't expect him to be going around telling people that Jesus had appeared to him and had forgiven his sins. So it's not totally crazy to think that he could have had this epiphany or theophany and sort of shelved it due to the other circumstances of his life, and then reflected on it in the 1830s, and reflected on it at different times and in ways that caused him to reshape it in different ways. I mean, I think the discussion, again, it's different depending on what questions you're asking. If you're really looking to either corroborate or discredit, say, the canonical account of the first vision, that's one discussion. If it's simply, does it seem credible that this young Joseph Smith saw and heard the Lord? Yeah, I can understand that he could have had an experience like that.
Yeah, I think the context that people think about most is if the 1838 account is to be taken as true, where he sees that God and Jesus are actually separate beings, that he's told that none of the churches are true, and that he is supposed to start the one true church or whatever it is that's in the 1838 account. Then that's information that would definitely shape and guide potentially his behavior in the 1820s, including whether or not he considers other churches, what he tells people, how he claims he has authority to start a church in 1830. So it's not about sort of being cynically trying to tear him down and destroy it. It's just about, do the facts line up to make the story at least plausible, or are there, again, just big red flags? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a totally fair question. So I don't think for Joseph, I don't think the question of whether any of the existing churches are true, I don't think that's fully settled. He talks about having some attraction for the Methodists. He later attends at least some Methodist class meetings or services with Emma Hale. He clearly is not interested in the Presbyterianism of his mother and some of his siblings. So yeah, I could definitely understand that as more of an open question than the first vision accounts suggest. I think perhaps if you're coming at it as a non-Latter-day Saint, as someone who's never lived within the church, one wouldn't expect the canonical account to be a verbatim transcript of a conversation between Joseph Smith and divine beings. And, I think taking it as such is definitely more of a matter of faith than history. I think it's really hard for anybody to construct almost any conversation with anything approaching verbatim accuracy a week after an event, a year after an event, let alone almost 2 decades after an event. So, I tend to think of the canonical account as, as a founding myth, really, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, rather than a strictly historical account of the particulars of that visionary experience.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. And I'm going to just, if it's okay, I'm going to try and reflect to you my understanding of the 1832 account versus the 1838 account, mostly for the benefit of never Mormons who have, or Orthodox Mormons that really didn't even know that there were multiple accounts. As I understand it, the 1832 account, he basically, only one personage apparently appears to him. He calls that personage the Lord. And, that's understood in the context of, Mormonism to be Jesus, not God the Father. So there's not two personages. There's one in the 1832 account. And then again, as you mentioned, he's not told to start a new church. He's not even told that all the other churches are false. He's just told that he will receive a forgiveness of his sins and that sort of thing. Have I characterized the 1832 account relatively accurately, or?
No, I think that's roughly correct. So, it's really clear that it's Jesus Christ because the divine being says, "I am the Lord of glory. I was crucified for the sins of the world," or something like that. So it's clearly Jesus Christ. The only thing I'd say is, there is an emphasis on the apostasy of other churches. The statement is not quite as definitive and clear as in the later account, but that theme is also there.
Okay. And part of why, for me, the first vision potentially starts to enter into smoking gun or red light territory is because when he comes out with the Book of Mormon in 1830, it seems like the Book of Mormon holds a more Trinitarian or modalist, I never get the difference between the two, view of the Godhead, meaning that Jesus and God are kind of the same being. And if you read the Book of Mormon in 1830, you have Jesus saying, "I and my Father are one," basically reflecting Protestant Christianity around the time of 1830, not, God and Jesus are separate beings. Then you see in Joseph Smith's own theology and evolution where God and Jesus separate by 1838. He's now believing that God and Jesus are separate beings. And then lo and behold, you have not only a new version of the first vision that's showing two personages instead of one, you also have changes to the Book of Mormon to reflect Joseph Smith's evolved theology. So there's that problem that he appears to be changing the Book of Mormon to reflect an ongoing change in his own theology, which then for me starts to throw up some red flags. But then also you have the information that Joseph Fielding Smith, the prophet or the church historian in the 1900s, when he comes across the 1832 version, number one, it was kept from members, but number two, apparently he rips it out of Joseph's diary and hides it for several decades, clearly out of a fear that if word got out that the original version came before and wasn't consistent with the 1838 version, it would likely cause problems. And so those are, for me, those are the really big red flags or red lights that say something really shady's going on here, because the Book of Mormon shouldn't be changing. It was a one God or two gods. You should kind of get that right and not change it. And then when the church is hiding the evidence, I think for many that actually starts to become red flag territory. Now, how much of that is valid versus not from sort of a balls and strikes umpire objective point of view, or attempting to be objective point of view?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, first of all, that's such an interesting question. So is it, I would say there's two different parts of that question. One has to do with what Joseph does in the late 1830s when he retells this story, right, and creates what's ultimately published as a definitive history of Joseph Smith. So that's one question. And then the second question is, what did later leaders of the church do, perhaps, to suppress that, alternative accounts to that history? So, and are those shady things? So the first one, in a way, seems not that shady to me. I think it's more.
You mean the Book of Mormon changes?
Well, I would say the changes in the late 1830s history. So from Jesus Christ to God the Father and Jesus Christ. I think it's fair. I think your question is a fair one, in that we know that Joseph has more definitively rejected what you could call the creedal trinity by the late 1830s. He is definitively teaching that God the Father and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit are separate personages, so three divine beings rather than one. Does that influence the way he retells the first vision? Quite possibly. Is he specifically introducing God the Father in that later history to make that theological point? I don't think we actually know that that's the case. Because, it's sort of strange if you're not a Latter-day Saint and you read the canonical account, it would be really easy to not think about the issue of the Trinity. So here are two personages. Here are God the Father and Jesus Christ. Well, there are a lot of paintings of God the Father and Jesus Christ created by Catholics and other sorts of Christians. So, it's simply a discussion of two personages. You could easily miss that. So I grant your point that Joseph's later theology probably, or could have, influenced the way he talked about his first vision. I don't see that as particularly shady. In terms of the church, how it addressed the fact that there were these different accounts. So I don't know. I'll have to refresh my memory on Joseph Fielding Smith and the document. So I can't actually speak to that. I do think it was alarming to church leaders to have documents surface that didn't line up with the canonical or accepted accounts. And so, let's just maybe I can just try out an analogy, John. Let's say that the New Testament only contained one gospel, say the Gospel of Mark. And, it had been that way. And then suddenly a Gospel of John surfaced, which is, rather different from the Gospel of Mark. And not everything lines up. Jesus doesn't necessarily act in the same way. He does things differently. He says different things. That would be really alarming to a lot of Bible-believing Christians, right? That would cause major spiritual angst, I think. The fact is, from a very early point, Christian churches maintained a belief in four gospels that don't all line up with each other and that do have discrepancies and even contradictions. And second century Christians were totally well aware of that and obviously could live with it. Doesn't necessarily need to be a big deal. I think the fact that, some of these other accounts, particularly 1832 history, because they come to light so many years later, in which Latter-day Saints and the church have grown attached to a single account. That created apprehension, angst. At first maybe a desire to keep these things at arm's length. More recently, a desire to harmonize, to find elements of congruity. So are there shady elements in that? Probably so. I can understand the alarm that some church leaders and church members have felt when these things came to light.
Got it. Okay. That's reasonable. And I really appreciate your willingness to kind of call balls and strikes in this regard. Really quickly, you mentioned on page 22 of the book, the version of the book I have, that there was a minister that rejected Joseph's claim. Is that just Joseph claiming he talked to a minister, or is there record of Joseph talking to a minister? I just wanted to get that clear.
As far as I know, there's no corroboration for that. I think that's in the canonical account.
Okay.
I think it really reflects the fact that, and I think it's a little bit hard for us today to recreate this, but Americans in the early 1800s, or Protestants in the early 1800s, they're very divided on the validity of visions, miracles, and a whole range of supernatural phenomena. And it's not crazy to think that if Joseph shared it with a minister, that minister would not be too thrilled to have this young man recounting just having had this message from Jesus, which didn't accord with what the Methodist minister was teaching.
Okay. So it's a reasonable story from your perspective, but there's no, we're trusting Joseph's later account.
Yep.
That happened. Okay.
Don't have anything else to go on.
Yeah. And that's just as kind of a historiography point, as I'm watching you retell the story, I'm always thinking some of these points he has to recount as if it happened, but we really don't have corroborating evidence that it did, but you have to tell the story. And so, like in this case, you're saying it happened. Those, there are going to be people who doubt that Joseph's trustworthy, but you're kind of stuck not having to give disclaimers for every part of the story, or the book would be 5 times as big.
It would be 5 times as big and 5 times as boring for sure. Yeah. No, I mean, you can't simply every step of the way simply say, a purported vision or just claim to have done this or that.
Okay. Yeah. So I've never tried to write history before, but my sympathies are with you in that regard. Okay. Last question about the first vision. Well, anything else you want to say about the first vision before we move to the treasure digging, money digging topic? Did we cover, you had mentioned, differences. I think there's 8 or 9. Some say there are 8 or 9 different versions, but maybe 4 main, different versions. Sometimes angels come, sometimes Satan binds Joseph, lots of other facts and details. Anything you want to say? And at the end of the day, are any of the major accounts differences red flags, or that at least Joseph Smith believed and or possibly credibly had some type of theophany?
So, yeah, good. Thanks for the opportunity to share anything else that's on my mind about this. I guess that's, 2 things that come to mind. So in the canonical account, when Joseph, recounts being really bound by Satan and, unable to speak, there's a similarity between that and, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, and an experience that Newell Knight relates about, I think, his hesitancy to pray vocally So that idea that Satan would make it difficult or impossible for someone to pray, that was a cultural experience that other people had at the time. I think the only other thing I want to mention is I'm glad you mentioned, there's so much discussion of the 1832 versus the 1839 account. Joseph does continue to talk about this vision with greater frequency toward the end of his life. So there's some journal accounts in which people record what he says. And one thing that he does toward the end of his life is he begins to describe the physical appearance of God the Father and Jesus Christ. They look very similar in appearance. I think he uses some biblical language to describe them. I think he describes their eye color at one point.
As blue or what?
It's blue, I think. I don't know if it's blue in every one. There's at least one account in which it's blue. In a way, the experience becomes more vivid, more corporeal. Maybe that also reflects, the development of Joseph's theology during the 1830s and early 1840s. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I know that in the Mormon temple ceremony films that I grew up on, they're white. They both look almost identical. They're basically white bearded men in white robes in the sky, and their skin is white. It's not just, it's a bright light. They're white humans. Yeah. They're white humanoids floating in the sky with white hair and beards. And you're saying maybe some of that was actually fashioned after Joseph's later commentary about what he saw?
It could be, yeah. I'm not sure whether that's the case. I actually write about some of those later accounts in more detail in one of my earlier books called the Mormon Jesus. But in the biography, I did mostly focus on the 32 and 39 accounts. And I guess
39 or 38. For some reason, I have 38 in my mind.
It's 38/39. Okay. So apparently Sidney Rigdon, under Joseph's direction, starts working on a history in April and May of 1838 once they get to Missouri. But we don't have that manuscript. It doesn't exist. So then what we have for what becomes the history of Joseph Smith are accounts created in 1839, but they might reflect the work done a year earlier. We don't really know.
Okay.
And if I could, John, let me just mention one other concluding thought on the first vision. So I had a number of people read drafts of my biography of Joseph Smith. And I did actually, when I wrote about the first vision when I drafted my account, I was a little bit more hesitant and careful about saying, well, we can't really know this, we can't know that. And one of my readers pressed me, come on, say if you think he actually, saw the Lord. And, I thought about it. And I thought that was a reasonable complaint. And I do think in Joseph's cultural context, it's not unreasonable to conclude that he had a visionary experience as a young man. So this is sort of my summative thought on it. Regardless of its particular content or exact date, there seems little reason to doubt the story's core, that a spiritually distraught young man saw and heard the Lord. I think for me, that's as far as I want to go. Okay. I can't know the exact date. I can't corroborate or discredit particular content, but I can believe that the young Joseph Smith saw and heard Jesus Christ, or saw the Lord.
Okay, yeah, and again, a questioning Mormon or someone investigating the church is interested in a little bit more, because the stakes are so high. For most people who really care about this question, it's not just they want to attack Joseph Smith. Right. It's more they want to know, wait a minute, did God are God and Jesus separate beings? Because that's kind of a big deal theologically.
Yeah.
I've been asking, Christians if they see Mormons as Christian, and so many of them just say Mormons aren't Christian because they don't believe God and Jesus are the same. You know what I mean? And that's enough to just have a whole bunch of Christians just not even count Mormons as Christian at all. But also it ties to the Mormon theology that we can all become God someday. It's kind of a really big deal.
Yeah.
But more than that, Joseph doesn't just claim to be starting a Christian church. He claims to be starting the one and only true church that God sanctions, and that all other churches are false. That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't appear till later, and it may have been made up and just inserted when he's, as he seems to do in other instances, when his credibility is threatened or his authority is threatened. And so he comes up with a Melchizedek priesthood out of thin air when those who are around him at the time say, hey, that Peter, James, and John experience with the Melchizedek priesthood, that never happened. Like, if he has that tendency to make stuff up when his authority is being questioned, that claim about that little part of the 1838-39 version about God telling him to start the one true church, that kind of really matters. And
Sure.
so,
Yeah.
I think that's why.
No, I totally get that. And more recent church leaders have placed tremendous weight on the first vision. So I might not get the exact quote right, but President Gordon B. Hinckley said something along the lines of, everything sort of hinges on the truth of the first vision. And if it's not true, then, this work is false. If it's true, then it's true. But I do think if you're if you're trying to start with Joseph Smith's life, when he's writing his accounts, he's writing them in the 1830s. He's thinking about how to present his life, how to explain the history of his movement. I don't think a biographer's task, right, would start with the I almost wouldn't quite start with what President Hinckley was saying in the 1990s. Joseph himself doesn't quite articulate it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I really, this is a big one. So I know we've taken 40 minutes to talk about it, but it's a big one. So it's worth at least 40 minutes. I'm going to end the first vision discussion with kind of flipping it around and asking you one final question. If somebody were to make the assertion that the 1838 account is just made up and Joseph just made it up out of whole cloth sometime between 1832 and 1838, and that pretty much most or all of it never happened, is there evidence, prior to 1832 that would legitimately counter that perspective? Do you understand how that's kind of looking at the question from a different standpoint? Or is really all we have are Joseph Smith's late recollections to buy any of the 1838 account?
So that's a good question. So whether we have anything to corroborate the 1838-89 account, well, first of all, I mean, it's not, the first thing I'd say is it's not totally, it's not a total lack of continuity, right? So, that concern about the apostasy of churches, that's there from the start. We at least have the corroboration of the earlier account of a visionary experience of deity. So, I don't think it's reasonable to say that based on other evidence, Joseph just makes this up whole cloth in 1838 or 1839. I think what is reasonable is to say when Joseph first tells the story of his life in any detail in 1832. So this is when he's 26 years old. He talks about a powerful, youthful, visionary experience. When he retells it at the end of the decade, he definitely tells it differently. Does that make it harder to believe in the particulars? Well, it probably does for some people. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. But I had a historian friend tell me once something that I thought was wise. He said, "We can't penetrate. We can't really study the religious experience of other individuals. We can only study the narratives that they created. So we can't penetrate to the marrow of anybody's religious experience. That'd be true if we only had one account, or if we had two accounts that totally lined up with each other. We only have the stories that Joseph chose to tell, and we don't have much else to go on. And so I guess I would just return to the point. I think it's reasonable, given what he shared, that he did have some sort of powerful visionary experience when he was 14, 15, 16. Beyond that, history, can only, academic history can only get us so far.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. Thanks for addressing the first vision so thoroughly, and for being such a good sport with my questions, John. Should we go to treasure digging next?
Sure. That sounds fun.
Okay. So let me just ask it. Let me maybe start it out this way. I was so delighted to read in my studying of treasure digging, Benjamin Franklin's account of the treasure digging sort of con, I don't know, 1770, 1780, like really, really early. It's almost like he's describing the type of behavior that Joseph Smith got into 40, 50 years before it happened. And, so for our Never Mormons, or for those who haven't really had a chance yet to dig into the book, and I want everyone to go buy the book and make this an international bestseller. But do you want to talk about, number one, kind of what the practice was? To what extent was it known to be a con before Joseph Smith participated in it? To what extent was it known to be legal versus illegal? And I'm talking about scrying, glass looking, treasure digging, whatever you want to call it. If you want to throw some pirate Captain Cook stuff in there, you can.
Yeah.
But then, and this is a big, long question, so you can talk for 20 minutes if you want, but to what extent was it a behavior that just uneducated, bumpkin, crazy, superstitious people did? Or, as the church wants to claim, it was the type of behavior that credible, thoughtful, well-respected people engaged in as late as 1826? So it's a big question. Take it where you want.
Okay, that's really fun. Yeah, the other thing I want to say just before we get into this, just because I don't want to forget it. I think whenever we get into a discussion about early Mormon history, people care a lot about it. You have a lot of listeners who, their experience in a church founded by Joseph Smith has had a deep influence on their life, positively or negatively. And so these are serious topics. I think treasure digging is an opportunity to also take a step back and think about it just a little bit less seriously. And let me try to explain where I'm going with this. I think a lot of elements of Joseph Smith's personality and activities, they involved a measure of mirth and fun. And I'm going to return to this when we talk about some accounts of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. But I also think it's worth mentioning in this context. I think for the young Joseph Smith, treasure digging, whether that was dousing with a witch hazel rod that might find sources of water, or whether that was using a seer stone to imagine the presence of lost objects or treasures buried in the earth. I think especially, if you're out at night with another group of people looking for things in the woods, going around with torches and shovels, and you're 16, 18, 19 years old in your early 20s, I have a feeling that some of those escapades were simply fun. I'm not saying they couldn't also be pregnant with spiritual meaning or greater seriousness. But I think Joseph found those pursuits pleasurable and fun and enjoyed doing them in the company of other young men in particular. So I thought I'd just preface that at the outset.
I think that's important because I literally don't think I've ever heard that idea of mirth introduced into this whole conversation. It's always super serious. Was there fraud? Is he a charlatan? But yeah, thanks for introducing that idea of fun, because it's like night games. We grow up playing night games, hide and go seek or whatever.
Capture the flag, right?
How could it not have had an element of that?
I think that's almost certainly true, and I don't actually think I might have mentioned that in the chapter. I might not have, but I know I do when I talk about some elements of the Book of Mormon story. But I think it was also true in this case. This is Joseph spending time with his family and his friends outside, imagining great riches, contemplating spiritual power. I do think that there was a strong element of mirth and fun. And I don't think, I think for some, it's certainly true that for some more educated Americans and ministers, these were simply disreputable activities, and could be scandalous. And there was, as this developed, there's concern about individuals being duped and conned. But I think, at least at first, I don't think there was just that strong element of scandal and seriousness with this.
So let me just ask, later we know, and your book discusses the fact that he ends up in trial, and I think being convicted of glass looking or disruptive, behavior. I'm forgetting the exact words you use. We'll get to it. But would it have been known as an illegal activity, kind of like, I guess, kids smoking weed these days, like something that kind of everybody knows is illegal, but lots of people do just because that's what, people do in the culture, is sometimes they break the law or speed, in their cars or whatever. And it's just kind of known to be illegal, but maybe not enforced or not a big deal.
So I think to do this professionally, it was illegal according to New York state law. So there's.
And was it known to be illegal?
It's a good question. I don't think we know whether or not the Smiths knew it was illegal. They certainly find out, right? As of 1826, my hunch is they probably would have known.
Okay.
By the time that Josiah Stowell hires them, I think they would probably have known that it was illegal. I don't know. I don't know that they would have regarded that with tremendous seriousness. It's not the worst thing you could do.
But also, you'll mention in your book that there were several people doing it, whether it's Sally Chase, whether it's who are some of the other characters?
Sam Lawrence.
Sorry, say it again.
Sam Lawrence.
Also Lumen Walters.
All right.
Like.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's.
And didn't the Josiah Stoll, didn't you mention the Josiah Stoll silver mine dig in Pennsylvania, that they tried a different glass looker before they brought on Joseph?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I know I wrote that name somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I love actually the quaint way that this story begins, which I think is at least possibly credible, that, Joseph meets a young woman named Sally Chase, who lives on a farm just over the hill from where the Smiths are living, and she has a green glass through which she can see wonderful things. And Joseph, I think he's entranced and enchanted with this. I mean, I think I do think he believes that such things are possible. And she lets him look in his stone. The story goes, I'm not quite sure how credible this is, that he can see a stone of his own that's ready for him to find and use. And seems that there's then an operation to try to locate it on the Chase farm, and both he and Willard Chase want it. Joseph ends up being able to use it, and he also claims that he can see things through this stone. Now, one of the great mysteries is that we can't fully answer is, does Joseph really believe that he can see things? Is he making up this power? Does he actually, when he looks into this stone, do things appear in his mind, in his imagination? We don't really know. And I wouldn't want to try to definitively answer that, but he gains a reputation as someone who's able to do that. And I find that, that's an interesting part of the story too. Within a few years, he gains at least a little bit of renown for this spiritual talent, to the point that somebody's willing to pay him money to do it.
Tell me if I'm right. I think it's John Hamer, maybe it's Dan Vogel. I'm trying to remember who made this point clear to me. It's twofold. He doesn't just become known as someone who has a gift or a talent. He's known as someone who has a magic rock, right? Like, as I understand it, the earlier you go in the treasure digging accounts, the power's in the stone. And then the first stone wasn't good enough. And then he wanted a second stone that had more power. And eventually he gets the Urim and Thummim, allegedly, which I think your book claims has the most power of all, but then he doesn't use it. But isn't it true that, yes, over time, what he does is he builds the perception that he has special power, but doesn't it begin with the belief that he has objects with special power?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, is it the stone or the man,
Or
right?
both, or both.
Or the girl, right? I mean, depending on, or the woman, depending on the case. Yeah, I don't know if it's totally a thing of one or the other. So, Josiah Stowell has a relative in Manchester, New York, near the Smiths, and through this relative, I think a son, he hears that Joseph Smith has the skill of telling where hidden treasures in the earth were by means of looking through a certain stone. So, in a sense, he hears about Joseph's skill. That skill is also connected to a certain stone, and there's definitely there's definitely a sense that Joseph may have had the skill, and he may have had the ability to use these stones, but yeah, that some are more powerful than others, and ultimately you want to have the most powerful one through which you can see anything.
Okay, so it's kind of a both, and it sounds like, I love it that you address this idea again, like with the first vision, that we'll never be able to know whether he believed he was seeing things in the stone or whether he was committing outright fraud. I guess we'll talk a bit more about the details, but I think it's pretty fair to say that he never ever finds treasure that he's able to produce for other people, that they can make money off of, whether it's the silver mine with Josiah Stoll, or other attempts at finding mines or treasure. And of course, you can say, okay, maybe he thought he saw treasure the first time or the second time, and oops, an angel, as soon as they were about to get the treasure, an angel took it away. But you would think after the second or third or fourth time, he would know that he's never actually finding treasure, even if we give him the benefit of the doubt that he believed he was seeing real visions in the stone. So, since he never really does produce treasure that people can monetize or even really see that isn't hidden or visionary, some would say that's evidence enough that he would have known he was probably a fraud at some point. Does that add up for you or not, that logic?
That's a good question. So I guess I would probably put it this way. I think by 1827, so this is after he's employed by Josiah Stoll. They don't find this silver. He's on trial. I think he's just allowed to kind of slip away and not, he's this young, irresponsible guy. I don't think the judge really wants to throw the book at him. He comes back to the area, courts Emma. I think during that time does a little bit more treasure hunting, never finds anything. So I think at the very least, by that point in his life, he's only 21 years old at this time. I think Joseph, whether or not he thinks he has a talent or a gift for seeing buried objects, he certainly knows he's not going to make a living doing that. I mean, he knows that's not going to happen. And I do think he feels at that point in his life, some despair and confusion about what direction his life's going to take. So you asked us, does he know he's being fraudulent? I don't know. I think he knows that he can't fairly claim to be producing treasures for money. It does seem to me that it doesn't have to all be one way or the other. So if he did believe that people could use particular objects to find buried treasures or other objects, like if he believed Sally Chase could do that, if he believed in the ability of other seers to do that, he might have thought that he had that talent. He might have wavered. He might have gone back and forth. He might have convinced himself he could see things when he looked into the stone. He might have felt chagrin and embarrassment when they couldn't. I don't know. I do think it is clear that by the time we get to 1827, he's not going to do exactly the same thing again. He then, at that point in his life, he claims to finally have retrieved a remarkable, valuable object. But it's sort of a new and slightly different direction. It's not exactly the same thing.
So let's talk a little bit about the Josiah Stoll silver mine and him meeting Isaac Hale and eventually Emma Hale. I think this is a really important part of the overall narrative because Isaac Hale is kind of a well-respected hunter, as your book lays out. He's an affluent man, but he's probably an intelligent man, and at least at first, your book lays out that he's a partner in this expedition, where he's a principal, which means he's probably financing these digs at some level with Josiah Stoll. And Joseph Smith is actually hired. And I went ahead and looked, and you mentioned that Joseph Smith is paid $14 a month. And I asked ChatGPT what that would be in 2025 dollars. It said about $452. So he's not making a lot of money, but he's making around $500 a month in equivalent dollars, which isn't nothing, especially if your family is destitute. And I think one of the important things to mention in the treasure digging is, what your book so clearly lays out, which is the Smith family is destitute. They're about to lose their house that they built. Farming hasn't worked out. Alvin dies, and Alvin, as your book recounts, was the main breadwinner. Joseph Smith Sr., you mentioned, has probably become depressed or an alcoholic. And Alvin dies, and again, they're about to lose their house, and the farming ventures had failed. So there is a monetary motive for Joseph Jr. and even Joseph Smith Sr. to do anything to bring in some money, or they're going to lose their house. Now, a financial motive for some then adds credibility to the fraud claim. But there's also the idea of motivated reasoning, that when we're desperate, we can fool ourselves. But regardless, Isaac Hale turns from sort of someone that was willing to give Joseph Smith the benefit of the doubt, who then went on some of these treasure digs with Joseph, who then saw that Joseph would say, dig, dig, dig. Okay, we're almost there. Oops, an angel took it away. Sorry, Josiah. Sorry, Isaac. The angel, the spirit took away the treasure, and, sorry, we're not going to be able to get treasure. Clearly, for an eyewitness, Isaac Hale turns at that point on Joseph and says, this guy's a charlatan. I don't want anything to do with him, and I certainly don't want my daughter marrying the guy. In modern times, Mormon apologists and even the Mormon Church would just discredit Isaac Hale as a bad actor, as an anti-Mormon, as a critic of Joseph Smith. But to me, Isaac Hale is a very important eyewitness that this was likely perceivably fraudulent behavior. Can you address sort of all of that? Isaac Hale, the treasure digging, and Isaac as a credible witness?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned, let me just back up and talk about one other thing that you mentioned, John, which I think is a really important part of the story, is the Smiths are about to lose their farm. So this is October of 1825. Alvin Smith, who really seemed to be the economic engine of the family by the early 1820s, he died in 1823. There are some twists and turns, but they are not going to make the final payment on their Manchester property, which is due in December of 1825. So they're going to lose the farm. I forget the exact amount they need, but it's a lot more than...
It's a couple thousand, I think.
Yeah, it might not be quite that much, but it's a lot more than the $14, that they're going to get as treasure diggers. So, there's a couple of things you could think. You said, well, they need any money they can get, but it seems on the face of it grossly irresponsible to head off with Josiah Stowell to search for treasure and leave Lucy Mack Smith and the rest of the family behind as this deadline is approaching. It would have been a lot better to hire out, earn as much money as you possibly can, find some other way of making that payment, as they ultimately sort of do, so they're at least not displaced. So it's strange, right? So maybe you could argue they actually think they might get the windfall. So maybe they sincerely believe they could go off and hope to find this silver, which would be maybe the only way they could save the property. So that's not totally crazy. I still think on some level there's an element of escapism and adventure and almost running away from a problem that the family probably could have found other ways of solving. So I think it's a strange episode to begin with. Then on the point of the
it's hard not to imagine Lucy saying, "Get your arses back here, get to work. We're about to lose the farm. Stop this silly treasure digging garbage." but there's no record
No.
of that ever being an issue, which is surprising to me.
Yeah, and you know, maybe I'm being too hard on the Joseph Smiths at the time. You know, maybe Lucy thought, look, the best thing you could do is go off and do anything you can to get this windfall and save the day. You know, I presume that she supported her father and son, you know, in these sorts of spiritual quests. That could also be.
I guess that's an argument for sincerity, that maybe Lucy supported them doing anything they could to get money.
Right.
And if they could get a bunch of silver, that would save the farm.
I mean, it wasn't a good idea, but maybe, right? And then the other thing so Isaac Hale, so he does support this venture at first. He boards, I think, I don't know that we know this for sure, but at least I think he boards the treasure diggers. I think he signs the articles of agreement as a witness. I don't know that he really bankrolls it, but he's at least supportive and he's open to it, which, you know, and I think that kind of gets back to your prior question, that the idea that people through seer stones or other magical means could find buried treasures, you know, it doesn't seem at first far-fetched to somebody like Isaac Hale. Then, and this is a recurring theme at other points in Joseph's life, right? Joseph fails in his ability to find the treasure. You know, it seems, according to the statements of others, that he says he can see it when he places one of his stones in his hat, blocks out the light. But because of enchantment or other obstructions, they just can't get it. Now, what's interesting is that both Isaac Hale and Josiah Stowell, you know, they might not be always present on the scene, but they're basically witnesses to these activities, and they respond in opposite ways. So for Isaac Hale, this is discrediting. This is evidence of at least bad behavior, if not fraud. Josiah Stowell has relatives who reach the same conclusion. They want Joseph Smith to beat it, to stop, you know, kind of succouring his, you know, their father, their uncle. But Josiah Stowell, as far as we know, to the end of his life into the early 1840s, he believes that Joseph has this gift. So he's not shaken by the fact that he fails. You know, he gets convinced of Joseph's ability when he first meets him, and the fact that Joseph doesn't deliver, that doesn't rupture his faith in Joseph, which I think is so fascinating, because I think, you know, your example of Isaac Hale is a good one, and then Josiah Stowell is just this great counterexample and a good reminder that two people can look at the same evidence, all right, or the same events, and reach totally different conclusions. And you see that again at other points in Joseph's life when things go awry. Like I write about that with respect to the Zion's Camp expedition in 1834, because they're unable to redeem Zion. Some people lose their faith in Joseph Smith. Other people find their strength confirmed by the same events. It's sort of a mystery about human religious engagement and affiliation. Yeah.
And I don't want to be off-putting by using harsh language, but there is that saying, I don't know if it was P.T. Barnum who said, there's a sucker born every minute. When we talk about fraud, there's this idea of a mark or a rube, a gullible person, right? And some would say Martin Harris becomes that when it comes to the production of the Book of Mormon. But when apologists, try and argue, look, yes, Isaac Hale, didn't believe, but Josiah Stowell believed until his last days. At first, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, well, that makes it a balanced thing. Yeah. I realized in my mind that if Joseph Smith had one power, let's just say he was a charlatan or a fraud. If he had one power, it was the ability to make people believe he had powers when he didn't. And so if there are people who survive a treasure dig when literally no treasure was produced, and he's sitting there with his hat and his stone, and he's saying, dig, 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 up, there it is, I see it, oh, the Spirit took it away. If somehow there are people remaining as believers in Joseph Smith's power after he fails and fails and fails and fails, and they're paying him, that's not a testimony to his power necessarily. That's a testimony of his genius in being able to convince people he has power when he clearly doesn't. Does that make sense? And that's just where rubes or gullible people or marks come into play in the human experience, and they're everywhere. So again, I'm not asking you to sort of put that pejorative on Joseph Smith, and I'm not even doing it myself. I'm just saying the fact that Josiah Stoll continued to believe in Joseph Smith's power gives us an example, almost like a precursor to what many say is what happens with the Book of Mormon, which is, even though there are lots of reasons to disbelieve the Book of Mormon narrative, there's people who still did, and you could say, yeah, they're a lot like Josiah Stoll, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fair question. I guess maybe the one other way to think about it is, we could think, if we wanted to, we could think about it as Stoll being, let's presume he's being duped. You know, Joseph knows he doesn't have this power, and he's saying that he does, and he's getting a little bit of money from Stoll.
Right.
Admittedly, not all that much money. So this is not some, enormous scandal, I don't think. But, what is Stoll experiencing? Maybe Stoll maybe he's just eating this up. Maybe he's having a tremendous amount of fun on this quest. Maybe I forget if Stoll himself is often out in the woods with the treasure hunters or not, but maybe for him this is thrilling and a break from the banal. I'm not saying that therefore it would make it okay if it is just fraudulent activity, but I think sometimes, I think all of us, and I don't think this is only true in religious contexts, right? We become attracted to people and movements. We embed our lives in them, and there are reasons we stick with them, even when there are contradictory things or failures, because those people and those movements, they're shaping our lives. We're getting things out of them, maybe other than the buried treasure.
Yeah, like they didn't have bowling leagues, they didn't have Monday Night Football. It could have just been a fun activity that people participated in when they would otherwise be sitting around looking at each other in a small log cabin somewhere, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been my cup of tea. I wouldn't have wanted to get bit by all the bugs in the woods, get the poison ivy or something like that.
Really, really quickly, there's in page 33, you mentioned, they kind of get desperate. They're not finding the treasure. So Joseph gets the idea of sacrificing a lamb. And so the group slaughters the lamb. Joseph walked in a circle around the dig site, sprinkling the lamb's blood upon the ground as a propitiation to the Spirit. And then you write, the sacrifice was in vain, the lamb was killed, but they still didn't find anything. I guess there's a degree of presentism where modern people would just be aghast that Joseph Smith sacrificed a lamb. I think there are also probably Christians that would say, oh, this is starting to branch into the occult, sort of like dark magic, witchcraft kind of territory. And this is where Joseph Smith really goes off the rails. And there are other people who account, pentagram-like things or like occult behaviors associated with the ritual of doing the treasure digging that really strays from Christianity into kind of what many would say are the dark arts. What would you have to say about the killing of a lamb and or those who are concerned that this is witchcraft, dark arts kind of territory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, one challenge that I think you have as a historian when you're reconstructing these things is, you mentioned before, like, do you have anything to go on other than Joseph's account? Well, often not really. Well, in this case, mostly what we have to go on is accounts of Joseph's critics, right? So, we don't know that he actually did it. I included it in part because there was a second account that at least had some similarity to it. I think that one might have involved a dog rather than a lamb. I forget the gory details. And so I thought it was worth including, even though we can't be sure. I think it does probably reflect that for some Americans, for some American Christians, treasure digging did smack of witchcraft. So these laws against glass looking, palm reading, I think they also they're often also in the context of making false accusations of witchcraft. And there's a scholar named Manuel Padro who wrote an essay, I think, in Dialogue about, this sort of interconnection between Joseph's treasure digging trials and the idea of witchcraft and the occult. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying it's possible that, Joseph's critics might have, embellished these stories to sort of tar him with the label of witchcraft, of something that's satanic rather than just fraudulent.
And they mentioned him carrying around a Jupiter's talisman. I think some have found that Lucy possessed a book related to witchcraft, that sort of thing. Anything else we're saying about just to the extent to which the family wasn't just into kind of, folk magic, but potentially, and there's also the idea that when Joseph ends up returning to the site of the plates, which we're going to talk about in a second, each year, isn't it on a date that's typically associated with the occult? Is it one of the equinoxes or something? Some sort of pagan.
It's right around then, and so I think that Mike Quinn and many others have documented that the Smith family, at least dabbled in this sort of thing. I think we have a pretty strong account, say, for Joseph Smith Sr. being a dowser. I know this is slightly different, and obviously Joseph and seer stones, in terms of talismans and other sorts of occult activities. I'm going to have to defer to other scholars on that. I mean, I think the Smiths were engaged on the margins in that way. I don't think it was really central to what they were doing.
Okay. Another quick question before we go to the plates. I do want to talk about the trial. I know you talked about him being let off. But before we get to the trial, before we get to the plates, really quickly, if you think of, and I'm going to maybe address this with you in a future episode more in depth, but if you just think about, number one, the fact that he was never able to find anything legitimate with the stone in the hat, and that he ends up on trial for glass licking or scrying or juggling or whatever it was called. Then he turns around and eventually ends up using the same stone in the hat to allegedly, quote, translate the Book of Mormon. It's kind of like he's using, you could say fraudulent tools to then do sacred work. Or if you don't want to use that term, you could say illegal tools, or you could say ineffective tools to then turn to do spiritual work. That seems to be concerning, if not discrediting. And that seems to be a problem for a lot of people, that that he would use the tools for treasure digging in the production of a sacred work, especially when he allegedly uncovers the Urim and Thummim. Why would he be using the tools of dark arts or the tools of folk magic, that are illegal? So that's number one. But then also, sort of like I don't want to the framework of like buried treasure that a spirit is guarding, that a spirit is withholding while he's using a stone and a hat. Guess what? That's exactly what he was doing with treasure digging. And it sounds a lot like the story of Moroni or Nephi and the cave or the plates in the hole in the ground in the Book of Mormon. It's almost like, for some people, it'd be reasonable to say that the treasure digging stuff really taints or infects the Book of Mormon narrative, because it's almost like he's like, okay, the jig is up. I can't keep doing this treasure digging thing anymore because I'm going to get busted, but I'll just pivot. I'll keep the artifacts because I've got a reputation for being able to see in a stone, and there's still people that believe in that. I'll just pivot. I'll still keep a treasure in the ground. I'll still keep some sort of spirit guarding it. But instead of like trying to make money, I'll just claim it was a spiritual work. And it's almost like he's just pivoting, but still continuing with the same sort of fraud or con. He's just making it more religious and making it so nobody thinks they're going to make money off of it. Do you see what I'm saying? Does the treasure digging structure infect for you in a reasonable way the later claims about the finding of plates and the production of a sacred book?
So the great question. I love the extended John Dehlin question. It's just, that's really fun.
Well, I hope it's not annoying, because some people hate it. But
No, I love it. So I approach that whole issue. I'm tracking with what you're saying, but I also approach it a little bit differently, in the sense of, I do think he pivots to a new thing using the tried and not true method, right? I guess you could say, because so he, I mean, he's enmeshed, I think, in this culture. I don't know that he totally believes it or doesn't believe it, but he does. I think at least a certain point in his life, he believes that people, especially if they find a powerful stone, they can see hidden buried objects. And somebody probably at some point, I don't think we know exactly how he stumbles upon the method. Somebody must have told him the best method is to, block out the light, look into the stone, right? And so I don't think and it does seem that he uses that method, or at least there's one account. I don't think it's from Joseph himself. I think it's from someone else that suggests he used that method to divine the location of the buried plates. And then we do have accounts of him using that method during the translation process. There's certainly faithful Latter-day Saints today who contest, what has sort of been an evolving consensus that Joseph used the seer stone and the hat during the translation process rather than Urim and Thummim. So people still argue about that quite a lot. But one way in which I would diverge a little bit from the way that you framed it is, okay, here's you said it, you made it sort of sound like Joseph's pivoting, but basically doing the old trick. So the method might be similar, but I want to stop and just say, what a remarkable pivot, right? So, let's say you're someone who's essentially a failed glass looker. Right? You've been hired to find this Spanish silver mine. You don't find it. What's your next act? Right? Digging wells. I mean, that'd be probable, right? Or, maybe doing other unsuccessful treasure hunts in Western New York State. Instead, what Joseph pivots to is producing something that is tangible and remarkable. He produces this 500 or 600 page book that he's also intending to sell. I mean, the family circumstances are still desperate. Joseph needs some kind of economic direction for his life, right? He doesn't want to be an unsuccessful. He doesn't want to be a farmer. That life doesn't have appeal for him, and so he pivots to something that's just utterly ridiculous, audacious, absurd, bold, and he pulls it off. Now, so if we're approaching this from the question of, is Joseph a true prophet? Is this church a true church? Then the question is, is he a true prophet or is he a fraud? For me, if you frame it like that, and I understand why for many people that's, those are the questions, but also, how does this failed glass looker produce this book? I mean, it's a remarkable pivot.
Meaning the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I mean, it's there are a lot of people going around looking for treasures, right? There are other seers for hire. Nobody else produces something like the Book of Mormon. So it is pretty remarkable if he can use the tried and not true method to do that. And maybe he actually finds something he's good at, which is, creating this epic narrative.
Yeah, I'll just say, if you study L. Ron Hubbard or Keith Raniere or, any founders of kind of modern high demand religions or cults, you'll find that they had failures or ran afoul with the law until they, decided to become religious leaders. And so, my sense is this is a problematic enough story that, again, most of us were raised having never been taught any of this history. And I think it was Hugh Nibley, the famous Mormon apologist of, like, I don't know, the 1940s through the 1980s or 90s, who basically denied that Joseph ever wound up afoul of the law, denied that there was a trial in 1826, I believe, and who I think is quoted as saying that if Joseph actually, ended up on trial for treasure digging, it would be one of the most damning possible things that we could discover about the church's founding narrative. So, there are a lot of people that would just say being involved in illegal, apparently fraudulent behavior is not a great look for being, for ultimately claiming to be the second most important person next to Jesus, who was called to found God's one true church upon the earth. So, I mean, it is audacious. It is, you can smile and say, this is fabulous. This is creative. What chutzpah, right?
Right.
But also it's not a good look in terms of the 1826 trial. And even what I understand to be his confessions to Isaac Hale, which he's reported to have said, I never really could see anything in the stones. It's almost as if to Isaac Hale, he's admitting that he was a fraud. So anything you want to say again about Isaac Hale's credibility, should Isaac Hale just be dismissed as not credible, as an anti-Joseph Smith guy? And anything else you want to say about the trial and the legal aspects before we move to the plates? I just want to make sure we cover everything we wanted to cover there.
Yeah, no, I don't discredit Hale. I mean, and there are many other people who are on the scene who have similarly negative views of Joseph. I do think so. I think it's always a temptation to, you want to get ahead in the story, right? And we know that Joseph Smith is going to publish the Book of Mormon, organize the Church of Christ, and, launch this religious movement that has affected millions of people. In 1826, 1827, he's this 21-year-old man from this impoverished family who is kind of doing these wacky things. Yeah, he's disreputable. And Hale understands that. I would say, think about Isaac Hale in 1827. he's willing to at least make peace with Joseph Smith and give him another chance. He ends up bitterly disappointed in Joseph's ongoing activities, right? And just, finds the story of the plates offensive, right? That Joseph's not showing him this purported object. But I think he also understands in 1827, after Joseph makes Emma, look, this is kind of a young, I think in Hale's mind, young, foolish man. I'm going to give him another chance. I'm going to hope he settles down. And, yeah, and I do tend to admire Joseph's chutzpah and audacity, partly because I'm kind of grateful to him for giving me this great story to write about. So I have to be a little bit forgiving, but yeah, I think we just can't quite get ahead of ourselves. This is still a young man who's in really tough circumstances and is trying to find some way of escaping from, that poverty, that directionlessness, that banality.
He also is trying to make good. And I think it's reasonable to say his family was under stress trying to figure out what God wanted them to do, what salvation was like and how it could be obtained. I think there were deep theological pressures pressing down on the Smiths, and and deep theological questions that I think are also very important drives that lead to this pivot as well, right?
No, I think so. I mean, I do think one thing that's actually a little fuzzy in my mind is how important is this second vision of the angel, the spirit. How important is that to Joseph between, say, 1823 and 1827? We don't really know. There seems to be enough evidence to suggest Joseph doesn't make up this story in 1827, or if he does, Lucy and others are sort of corroborating these earlier experiences for him. But, it does seem like he has some sort of vision or idea several years earlier. It does seem...
You're talking about the Moroni or the Nephi. I think it's been questioned whether he originally claimed it was Nephi or just a spirit or Moroni. But that was what, 1823, where he claims he was visited by a spirit?
1823. I think in the 1832 history, he simply refers to an angel that's not named. And I think there are some other accounts where it's a spirit. Maybe I forget. And people argue about it. It does seem like there are some references to Moroni before the 1839 account. So I'm happy just to call it an angel or call it Moroni. I don't think that's super critical. But I do think we don't know how important that is in Joseph's life. That's not what seems to be attracting people like Josiah Stowell to him. That story doesn't seem to be in broad circulation. He may go there to the hillside every year. Seems like he brings Sam Lawrence, this other treasure hunter, one year. But in my own mind, and I think I say this in my book, it doesn't seem to be front and center in Joseph's mind or activities during these years until 1827, after the trial, after his marriage, when he's getting ready to move back to Manchester with Emma. They're trying to decide really where to live and what he's going to do. Isaac Hale wants him to settle down on his property and become more respectable, and Joseph refuses to do that in a pretty grand way.
Let's talk a bit about the context of the stories, the core narrative that ends up emerging from the Book of Mormon, from which Moroni emerges. And I think of that as being the mound builder myth. Did you spend time learning about the mound builder myth that then informs the book, The View of the Hebrews. But as I understand it, the Tanners were able to find like 8 or more books that all sort of had this core narrative of some sort of Israeli origins to Native Americans, and even this idea that there were dark-skinned and a light-skinned, groups of Native Americans, and that eventually it was the light-skinned Native Americans that built the cool mounds or the cool structures, and it was the savage dark-skinned Native Americans that killed off the light-skinned ones. That's my understanding of this narrative that sort of informs the core narrative structure of the Book of Mormon, called the Mound Builder myth, that was existing in the decades prior to the creation of the Book of Mormon, that Joseph was swimming in. Did you study that at all? And if so, to what extent can you corroborate or even shed light on the Mound Builder myth?
Yeah. So first of all, the idea that Native Americans, or at least some Native Americans, are descendants of Israelites or the lost tribe, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that's pretty commonplace. It's not that everybody believes that, but that idea has been bandied about in what becomes the United States since at least the 1600s, and there may be earlier antecedents, non-English ones as well. So that's not that surprising. That is sort of just in the cultural stream. In terms of dark skin, light skin, I don't know. I might have to refresh my memory a little bit, John. I'm trying to remember what I've read in View of the Hebrews and then in the Spalding manuscript. I think one of those might have the light and dark skinned idea. I do think one thing about, and then your question was about mound builders. To be honest, that's something that I've not studied all that closely. What I would say is that you can find these points of connection. Joseph doesn't just totally take and run with any of the existing ideas. So like he doesn't really use the 10 lost tribes. Dark skin as opposed to red skin is a little bit more unusual. So, I don't think it's a case of, I think it is a case of Joseph being influenced by his culture. I don't think it's so much a case of any direct borrowing, which isn't what your question suggested anyway.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain that this again, it's kind of a straw man to say that anyone credible is claiming that the Book of Mormon was like plagiarized or lifted whole cloth or even partial cloth from other existing books. But I'm fairly certain that this idea of dark-skinned and light-skinned Native Americans, where the dark-skinned were savages and the light-skinned were more industrious, intelligent, capable ones who then were killed off by the dark-skinned. I'm pretty sure that that was relatively commonly perceived by many during Joseph Smith time, and it's just important because if the Book of Mormon isn't historical, then either Joseph Smith made it up you he brought it together from other things in his environment.
Sure.
And so I do want, if you haven't come across that in your studies, I at least want to alert viewers and listeners to the Mound Builder myth. I think there's even a book called The Mound Builder Myth that talks about it, but I think it's a really important part of this equation if you're trying to understand, number one, where Joseph might have come up with the ideas for the Nephites and the Lamanites, but also maybe why it would have been accepted by many people as well.
Sure. No, I mean, that's a fair question. I have looked at that book, but it's been a while. I'll refresh my memory for next week. I would say that, in broad strokes, I think you can find some of these. You absolutely can find some of these building blocks. Israelite ancestry for Native Americans, good guys and bad guys. Like the idea of having the good guys be lily white and the bad guys be dark. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just not that. It's just not that uncommon. The idea of people traveling by boat to the Americas is not, that's something that exists as well. And we'll talk more about the contents of the Book of Mormon, I presume, in a later episode. And the issues you raise are really important. I think also Joseph's engagement with biblical narratives, that's an equally obvious source. So we'll have lots to talk about.
Okay. And then I think it's also important to mention that we have accounts by Lucy, because ultimately the question we're going to have to face when we talk about translation is like, if the Book of Mormon wasn't a translation of an ancient record, then somebody wrote it, and then it would have either been Joseph that wrote it, or someone else wrote it, Joseph stole it, or Joseph collaborated with other people to write it. One of the important pieces that touches on the time frame we're talking about, as I understand it, is Lucy's account that as early as the early 1820s, Joseph could speak for hours and tell stories about Native American characters or figures. And so if you're trying to later come up with an explanation for how he could dictate stories for long, stretches of time for the scribes, and to be able to do it with such detail, then that account from Lucy that he was already telling stories about Native Americans by the fireplace for hours on end with much detail as early as 1823. Do I have that right, or am I?
No, you're totally right.
Okay.
So I forget exactly how she frames, but essentially, I think it's after his first encounter with the angel that she says something along the lines of, Joseph would essentially regale us with, stories about, the ancient native peoples of the Americas, something like that. And, thought a lot about or you could say imagined about their culture and their history.
So it could have been he was developing these stories for the 5 or 6 or 7 years, an oral tradition of telling these stories of maybe Laman and Lemuel or Nephi or Moroni or King Benjamin or whatever, that he was developing the detail around these stories by firelight for many, many years before he had the idea to actually put them down into a book. Is that too much of a stretch? Is that plausible?
I don't think it's implausible. I think other than that comment by Lucy, we don't have a whole lot to go on, which again just speaks to the fact that we've been talking about Joseph's life in the 1820s, basically the stretch of time from when he's 14 up until 1827 when he's 21. We don't know that much about how he's spending his time. And so, but yeah, I mean, I do think it's sort of a tantalizing comment from Lucy Mack Smith that Joseph has spent years contemplating stories and maybe working these things out in his mind. And I certainly wouldn't want to suggest, I don't think it's necessary to suggest that he makes up everything in the Book of Mormon over the span of 2 months, or, the 2-step translation process.
Okay. Okay. So if we're talking about now his claim that an angel or even Moroni visited him in 1823 and said, there are these plates and they're hidden in a hill nearby, and you should visit them every year, and eventually you're going to get them and translate them. You said you weren't quite sure how important that story was to Joseph between 1823 and 1826 or 27. But also there's a suggestion that Alvin was supposed to go with Joseph his first time to look at the plates or see them, but then Alvin dies, and then he has to figure out other people to go. To what extent was either his family or people around him in the neighborhood all like buzzing, like, whoa, Joseph's seen an angel. Joseph knows where golden plates are. Joseph's going to be producing this Book of Mormon someday. Like, to what extent was that just some random story that everyone forgot, that Joseph wasn't even paying attention to, versus something like either neighbors or even the family were hanging hopes on or like really investing in? Because clearly Alvin was invested at some level before he died, right?
Yeah, well, Lucy says that Alvin was, and so I wouldn't want to discount that. We don't have a whole lot for corroboration, but it does seem that he takes Sam Lawrence to the hillside one year. But the funny thing is, we talked before about the first vision that, well, why wasn't the neighborhood buzzing with Joseph having seen Jesus Christ or God the Father and Jesus Christ? The neighborhood also doesn't seem to have been buzzing with stories about an angel and the golden plates. If it were, I would have thought that's what might have attracted Josiah Stowell to Joseph, but it's not. It's his ability to find lost objects. This story doesn't seem to be well known. So I guess I bet that maybe the way I can satisfy myself with this is I think I want to believe Lucy that, and maybe Joseph, that he has this experience. He shares it with his family. He does return to it from time to time, but it doesn't seem to consume him or them the way that we think it should. And it only really rises to the fore when he and Emma prepare to return from Harmony to Manchester in September of 1827. Then it becomes front and center. Then he tells Josiah Stowell and Joseph Knight Sr. about the golden plates. They plan to come and visit. That's when I think this excitement really builds. And I think that's when excitement also builds within the family. I like this story. It's from Joseph Knight Sr.'s history. At least I think it is, in which Joseph comes home late one night, and I think he's looking downcast or troubled, and he tells his father, Joseph Smith Sr., I've just had the most severe chastisement of my life. And his father, he's upset. He thinks somebody's confronted and maybe insulted his son. And then Joseph reveals, it's been a conversation with the angel who's told him that he's been negligent, which also suggests this hadn't been front and center. And I want to return to the idea of mirth and fun. I think Joseph has some fun with this story. And, like the way he apparently told that to his father, I think he also had an ability to draw other people into his story with that sort of thing. But I think this just really comes to the fore in September of 1827. Stowell and Joseph Knight, they're coming to visit. Joseph has to deliver, I think, or at least he feels he's got to make this pivot. He's got to finally come through after a couple of years of failure. And
when you say pivot, do you mean just with a career as a way to be a provider?
Well, I think he's got to come through with recovering an object from the earth. But yeah, but both that and a way to provide for his family in a new direction. But I've talked about the fact that people like Stowell could endure Joseph failing and not lose their faith in him. But this has, really been built up. They're coming to Manchester because he's going to retrieve the plates at this particular time. And I suppose, maybe he could have come back and said, well, I didn't do everything correctly and it's going to be next year. But I think he really does feel pressured to produce.
One of the things that, disturbed me once I started studying church history is the fact that it was never told to me that Joseph and Emma eloped, in that they eloped because Isaac didn't want Emma to marry Joseph. And the reason why Isaac didn't want Emma to marry Joseph is because he believed that Joseph was involved in really shaky, flaky, fraudulent kind of behavior. And, the fact that Joseph would kind of apparently abscond with Emma, although that may not be giving enough credit to Emma, but that struck me as another, I guess, chink against Joseph's character, the fact that he wouldn't just like go to Isaac and say, I want to marry your daughter, give me your permission, and then respect the father's wishes that the father said no, that instead it's sort of the shady abscond with Emma and then disappear for 6 months or whatever, all against, Isaac's best wishes for his daughter. What would you say about that? Am I being too hard on Joseph for that?
Well, I mean, I can understand why Isaac Hale wasn't happy. As I said before, I think he's actually, he has some forbearance with them. He is willing to overlook that. What he just wants Joseph to do is settle down and, become more respectable. But yeah, he says basically, when I wasn't home, Joseph Smith carried off my daughter. So he's totally upset about it. It seems like Emma, I think when she tells the story many years later, she hadn't even necessarily planned to marry him when they drove off, but then decided to, and they go to the justice of the peace, they get married. And yeah, Isaac Hale is steamed. And, I think if Joseph had asked him, I don't know what he would have said. I mean, I think it would have at least been a not yet. Why don't you work on my farm for a couple of years and we'll see.
Is it, on page 35, I read through your account. Is there any suggestion that Joseph Smith maybe took advantage of Emma, that sort of thing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the way she, it's kind of funny when she talks about it decades later, she, it didn't sound actually in her telling, but this is many decades later, she didn't make it sound super romantic. She simply said, she preferred to marry him to any other man. And I will say, I really wish we knew more from Emma's perspective about the events of these years, because she's with Joseph when they go off to retrieve the plates. And we just don't know very much about her role in these activities, which, is a source of endless frustration as a historian. Okay, really quickly, as we're kind of finishing up chapter 3 of your book, there are these visits to the hill, and there are a bunch of people now invested in the story, to the point where, I don't know, villagers and friends are all potentially having designs on. They hear that Joseph obtained the plates, but they were always covered, which is a sure sign of a fraud if he can't just show them to people. Like, what a convenient excuse that he's got to keep them hidden. But somehow even Emma still believes that he got something. And there are people who say they saw parts of the plates. Were they made up or not? Were they fashioned or not? Were they brass? Were they gold? But eventually, there are all these rumors and people trying to find the plates, and Joseph's trying to hide them and putting them in boxes and nailing up the boxes and putting them in barrels and running away and fighting off people who are trying to steal them. It's a really interesting series of stories that on the one hand sound almost swashbuckling, but on the other hand sound really silly and like a bunch of fool's errands and a bunch of superstitious people running around believing in silly things, making much to do about nothing. I really was grateful at the end of chapter 3, and I don't know if it's a spoiler to have you read your conclusions about all that, but I was really, really impressed that you were willing
to sort of write out your opinion of, after having reviewed all the evidence, your conclusions about, whether or not, an angel delivered golden plates to Joseph and whether the evidence sort of bore that out. Do you want to talk about all that and what your conclusions, what conclusions, your best conclusions were that you shared about that?
Sure. Yeah, honestly, John, that it wasn't an easy chapter to write because we're in a bit of a bind with regard to this story. It's not that we don't have multiple sources, but we just don't have really satisfactory or complete sources, which I suppose is always the case. So, we have the testimony of people who were close to Joseph, who believed that he had what he said he had, that he had golden plates. We also have supernatural, what I'd call sort of supernatural witness statements, to that point. Then we have all sorts of statements from Joseph's detractors. We also have a lot of theories for what could be going on. So if Joseph didn't have golden plates, well, he had something, right? He had some sort of object under a cloth that some people said felt sort of like what he described, metal. He had a heavy object in a box. So again, he had something. So, what did he have? Did he fashion something like, did he make plates out of tin or something? Did he stumble across printing plates? Did he just have a brick in the box? What did he do? I mean, I think that the thing that's hard as a historian is there isn't evidence. There isn't good evidence for any of these alternative explanations, right? There's no proof, so to speak, that instead of golden plates, Joseph had any other particular object. We just, can't prove it, right? But for me, I like to say the absence of evidence for alternative explanations is not itself evidence that Joseph really did have golden plates. So I'll just read a little bit of my conclusion, if that's okay.
Please.
So I think readers deserve an author's best sense of what transpired. In this case, it is that Joseph did not have golden plates. When someone refuses to show a hidden valuable object to others, the simplest explanation is that he does not possess it. There are other factors that point to this conclusion as well. As indicated in his conversations about the plates with his father and Joseph Knight, Joseph Smith was a playful young man who enjoyed jesting with others. He and his family were desperate for money, and Joseph was eager to prove his bona fides as a treasure hunter after repeated disappointments. He had sufficient motivation to engage in a bit of subterfuge. And I'll abbreviate because I think there's some other evidence we could look at in terms of the published Book of Mormon itself. But then, whether Joseph fashioned plates or put some other object in the box, the act was more audacious than mendacious. It wasn't just an angelic vision. It wasn't even just engravings on a buried stone or on a scrap of metal. Joseph staked his reputation on a physical object, on a treasure, even more remarkable than a lost Spanish silver mine. It was remarkably bold gambit. And it worked. What Joseph related convinced a wide array of individuals, including family, friends, and hostile competitors. The plates were real to them. The young seer knew he now had to produce something tangible. He insisted that the plates would be valuable not for their precious metal, but for their precious message.
Is it possible that what you just read is different from the version that I have?
Possible, but it shouldn't be too different. What do you have?
I'm seeing slightly different text, but it conveys the same sense.
Okay.
Or I may just have gotten lost at where you were reading, but either way, yeah. Well, so few, Von Brody obviously says he was a charlatan. Dan Vogel calls him a pious fraud, meaning that he believed he was guided by God and believed in Jesus, but was willing to kind of deceive people to lead them towards a belief in God and Jesus. And then there's people like Richard Bushman that are like, oh, his claim of plates are actually the biggest evidence that he wasn't a fraud. The claim of plates, there's so many people that had interactions with the plates that alone is strong evidence that Joseph Smith really was experiencing what he claimed he experienced. Given all that, I think it's really, I'm really grateful that you're willing to sort of lay out what your conclusions are. So I appreciate that.
Well, thanks, John.
You also, I don't know if you also mentioned in the same closing part of chapter 3, then there is the published Book of Mormon, which Joseph claimed was a translation of the engravings on the plates, archaeology, DNA, analysis of indigenous Americans, and the relationship between the Book of Mormon and the Bible all point to the Book of Mormon as a 19th century creation. I think that's a really important point. I've heard someone say once, it's not that the Book of Mormon is so miraculous that a boy like Joseph Smith or a young man like Joseph Smith could have never created it. The way to look at it is the Book of Mormon is such a reflection of Joseph Smith, his thoughts, his family, the milieu he was swimming in, that you can make the argument that no one but Joseph Smith could have authored it. Do you have a response to any of that?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say is I just also want to step back and say, what I'm really trying to do in, those closing paragraphs is, I think you have an obligation when you're writing about a subject just to say your best sense, right? Give your best judgment. I also think in a way, the traditional story of Joseph Smith, or the faithful story of Joseph Smith, and there are more subtle versions of this too, but I would say oftentimes Joseph Smith himself is unremarkable in that God simply chooses him and he translates this by the gift and power of God. And the record is whatever was on the plates. And so there's not actually much room for Joseph's creativity or even genius, if you will. If you conclude that there were no golden plates and that Joseph, at least mostly on his own, or let's just say on his own, authored this text, that somebody, I agree that given his background, his engagement with the Bible, his family, his imagination, his mind is capable of this text. But for someone in his circumstances to produce this book and publish it, given where he started in 1827, that is pretty remarkable. Not a lot of people would have just been able to pull it off in terms of getting it to, to be published.
Yeah, and I think you also make the point, and I think you may have even read this, that one thing that's undeniable is that, like with the treasure digging and Josiah Stoll and others, it's absolutely true that whatever happened with the plates, whether he made tin plates, whether it was a rock or a brick, there were many, many people who were influential who emerged from the 1827s, 28s, 29s, and 30s, absolutely believing that Joseph obtained golden plates and considered themselves in some way or another to be witnesses to that fact, or at least absolutely believed it. He was able to convince them that he did it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he was. And I'm also going to return to the idea of fun. I know, because I think history should be fun. I think Joseph has a really good time doing this. The accounts of harrowing journeys through the woods, moving the plates around, stashing them here and there, conflict with other people in the area, talking to many people about this, sharing his story. I I don't think fun and religion, they always have to be at odds anyway. But obviously, this is a super serious, even tender subject for a lot of people. But again, I think Joseph enjoys these sorts of escapades. He talks later in his life about how much he enjoys excitement and risk and danger. And I think those elements are definitely present during these years as well.
Okay. Kind of last question along these lines, and then we'll wrap up. I appreciate your time today and your insight and expertise, John Turner. I think, a secular a secular way to explain kind of what happened is, the Smith family was in financial ruin. Farming wasn't going to work out. Joseph had to figure out how to help contribute financially to the family. He had fun treasure digging. Maybe he said, "Hey, let me make a go of this treasure digging thing." He did that for several years, made a little bit of money, developed his reputation, developed his brand, so to speak, in being someone with special power who can find things that clearly had value to him later. But then he runs afoul of the law, realizes that he can't keep claiming to find buried treasure, at least in terms of making people think he's going to help them get rich. He's got this religious background. He's been the storyteller about Native Americans. And you could even see View of the Hebrews itself as a book that was associated with Oliver Cowdery and Ethan Smith, and even the Dartmouth school that we discussed last time. View of the Hebrews comes on the scene in 1823, which is right around the time he claimed to first see an angel who was talking about plates and then eventually a book. A secular explanation would be, once he knew he couldn't do treasure digging anymore, he had the idea, maybe I can be an author and maybe I can write and publish a book that would do multiple things. It would make me money. It would give me a profession. It would give me more notoriety, but also it could tell a fun story, an interesting story, and potentially address some of the religious or theological questions of the day. And this was just sort of a pivot to make good with Emma, to make good with Isaac, to be his next step in his career. But that he thought, I could just write a book, or I could claim that the book has mystical divine origins. And a book that has mystical divine origins, that even has a theological bent, is more likely to sell a lot more copies than just some book where I'm just making up fiction and everybody knows it's fiction. So if I were to say that's a more plausible secular explanation for what likely happened, would you say the evidence does or does not line up with that sort of secular narrative or explanation?
I mean, I suppose you could say that in my biography, I'm basically giving a somewhat similar secular naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is you just also, when you're laying it out right there, John, it almost sounds like a reasonable idea, but it's totally crazy. I mean, very few people make money selling books. Like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. I think Melville does. I mean, he's regarded as one of the greatest American authors in history, and he didn't make any money selling his books.
That's Moby Dick, right?
Right. So, the idea that Joseph Smith, the idea of making money by publishing a book, no matter what you say about the book's origins, it's such a bad idea. And, it doesn't sell for money quite as well as he hopes, but it succeeds in other ways. I'm just, I think one thing about Joseph Smith is that I say a couple times in the book is whenever he encounters failure, he sort of triples down. If his plan fails, he comes up with a much grander plan. And this is a great example of it. I mean, the Spanish silver mine is a failure, and he's sort of, he doesn't know where to turn next. And so this is really crazy. This is not, if I bet if you could have gotten together with Joseph Smith in early 1827 and said, let's brainstorm how you can make a living for your family. Publishing the Book of Mormon would not have been high on the list in terms of how to pull it off. Yeah, I mean, sure, like people believe in your ability to find buried treasure. Well, maybe you should head west to Ohio and get people to invest in a treasure digging operation there. I bet he could have pulled that off and could have made a few $100 or something like that. He doesn't do that. He does something that is just it's just incredible. I just think it's an incredible gambit to try to I think there is evidence he's hoping the Book of Mormon will make money. He's interested in book sales. He squabbles with Martin Harris over the book sales. He's going to sell the copyright in Canada. So I don't think economic motivations are absent. It's just it seems like a terrible idea on the face of it, almost 100% destined to fail, and it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, what I love, John Turner, after two episodes in with you, I love your emphasis on mirth. To be honest, you really can't argue that Joseph Smith wasn't very likable. He clearly, who among us has developed a following of up to 17 million people across almost 200 years? Like, you had to have been on some level a likable person to develop such a large group of loyal followers. And so I love it. And again, some of us who feel really impacted by the church's truth claims, sometimes in negative ways, are going to have a tendency to want to feel angry or frustrated or accusatory of Joseph. And, there's a place for all that. And what we can't forget is no matter what he did later in his life, this is a bold, creative, in some ways likable, if not impressive and entertaining character when you consider where he came from and what you could say what he was able to accomplish or whatever he was able to pull off. Either way, he is a fabulously fascinating and entertaining American figure of the 19th century. And I think you're doing a good job of reminding us of that.
Well, thanks. It's been fun talking about it with you.
Okay. Well, before, I guess there's a couple things I want to do really quickly, and then I want to give you a final word. First of all, I want to just remind people, go buy this book right now. Buy it for yourself, buy it for friends. Let's make it a New York Times bestseller. It is available now. It's called Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet by Yale University Press by John G. Turner. Please go buy it. That's the first thing. Secondly, we want to do more of these episodes with John. So far, we've had about 8 people donate about $500. But we think, just like Matt Harris, we were able to pay him very generously for his series on Second Class Saints. We want to be able to pay John Turner very generously for his participation in the series, because we've got a lot to go. He's promised at least 8 more episodes where he's going to be calling balls and strikes on all sorts of things. But I want to be able to pay him for that, even though he's not making that a condition for his participation. So here's how you help. Other than buying the book for yourself and many other people, go to donorbox.org/Joseph Smith and just become a monthly donor to this project. And for the next few months, we'll hopefully gather several $1,000s, and we'll be able to pay John to do multiple episodes. If we can't pay him, I don't feel great about asking him to spend his time that way. And most importantly, if you're deriving value from this series, please sign up to pay him, because this isn't something I need to do for Mormon Stories to succeed. This is sort of extra. And again, I just think we need to pay John for this. So please donate to this series. Please spread the word and get other people to support it. Even if we can get a few donors of means to just donate a large sum, I think it would be a real sign of respect, because I think, honestly, John Turner, do you when you write a book like this, I know that you want to try and make some money back, but let's just ask it this way. for the average book like this that's published, do you even have a sense for what the average academic author might even make, if anything, from a book like this? And maybe you don't want to talk about specifics, but I just get a sense that academic books don't do very well.
I don't know. I'd be happy with $14 a month. Like,
I get that reference.
so,
Okay. All right.
yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing is that for me, the history is really fun. And I'll just say that I actually find it hard to write about something like the golden plates, because for faithful Latter-day Saints, that's sort of treading on sacred ground. And I'm a Protestant Christian. If I read really, I don't know, critical accounts of the New Testament or certain things, that can make me feel, I don't know, a little bit less than totally happy sometimes, or, the things that I might have to struggle with. So, and at the same time, I also get that, for people who are maybe formerly Latter-day Saints or skeptical, these are really front and center questions. For me, reconstructing Joseph Smith's life, it really was fun. I mean, the sources and the stories are remarkable. I had a really great time writing the book. I hope people have a great time reading it. But I love talking about all of the many questions about Joseph Smith that matter to so many people. I don't think that historians need to just sort of shove them aside.
All right. Beautiful. So any final things you want to share today, or any preview you want to give for what we're going to talk about next week?
I'm guessing we're going to talk about the translation and contents of the Book of Mormon. But as ever, I'm open to anything, John.
Yeah. And so we're definitely going to cover Book of Mormon translation and the content of the Book of Mormon. And maybe you can look up the Mound Builder myth a little bit. And also, I want to encourage our viewers and listeners. I don't know if you ever go up to YouTube and actually read the comments. We actually delete all the lame comments, and the ones that we allow to remain are pretty reasonable and interesting. So, John, if you feel like it, go up to YouTube. I'll ask our viewers and listeners if you have any questions or comments for John. We'll have him. We'll try and get him or have him review those questions or comments. We'll try and maybe bring those up next time, potentially. But yeah, we're definitely going to talk about the translation of the Book of Mormon, and possibly maybe we'll get to the witnesses. We'll see how much time we have. But also, we just want to invite you, our viewers and listeners, to share any questions or comments or disagreements or supporting information you have. That will be interesting as well.
All right. See you next time.
All right, John Turner, thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories.
Thanks.
And last thing I'll say is that everybody, there are other ways you can support us aside from donating, liking this episode, subscribing to this channel on YouTube or Spotify or wherever, Apple Podcast, wherever you consume it, and commenting. That all helps with the algorithm. And then I do want to thank our bread and butter Mormon Stories donors that make the Open Stories Foundation and Mormon Stories possible. We couldn't even get this far with John Turner without your support. So thank you to our monthly donors. And we really appreciate it. So again, this is one in a series. We're releasing this series, the Joseph Smith podcast, as its own podcast, like we did Second Class Saints and like we did the LDS discussion series. But we're also integrating it into the Mormon Stories YouTube channel feed and the Mormon Stories podcast feed on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for all your support. Feel free to email us with any feedback or questions you have at mormonstories@gmail.com. We look forward to joining us for future episodes. Be good to each other, be kind to each other, and we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.